Welcome back. And 48, Harlem, a world of power, loyalty, and unspoken rules. Bumpy Johnson ruled these streets, and everyone in his circle knew one thing crossed the line, and there's no coming back. But what happens when someone closest to him dares to overstep, targeting his own daughter? What unfolded next shocked everyone and changed the rules of the game forever. Tonight, we're stepping into Harlem, 1948, a world of power, loyalty, and consequences. When you worked for Bumpy Johnson, respect wasn't optional, it was survival. What happens when someone in his inner circle crosses a very personal line? One decision involving his 26-year-old daughter would send shockwaves through his world. Before we get into it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you appreciate deep, true data research and the time it takes to uncover these historical moments, make sure you subscribe and support the work. In 1948, Bumpy Johnson wasn't just another name in Harlem, he was the name. A strategist, a businessman, a man who demanded loyalty above all else. The people around him understood the rules. You don't disrespect the boss, and you definitely don't disrespect his family. Among those in his trusted circle was his driver, a man who had close access, daily proximity, and inside knowledge of Bumpy's operations. Being that close to power can do one of two things. It can humble you, or it can make you forget your place. At some point, Driver allegedly made a move toward Bumpy Johnson's 26-year-old daughter. Now, she was an adult, but that didn't matter. In that era, in that world, intent meant everything, and perception could be just as dangerous as action. Word traveled, and in Harlem, word always travels. When Bumpy heard about it, it wasn't just about a romantic advance. It was about boundaries. It was about loyalty. It was about someone from the inside thinking the rules didn't apply to him. For a man like Bumpy Johnson, reputation was currency. Respect was armor. If someone close to him could cross that line without consequences, what message would that send? People who knew Bumpy described him as calm, calculated, not explosive. But when he acted, it was deliberate. And it was final. The driver quickly learned that proximity to power doesn't equal permission. In circles like that, trust is everything. Break it once, and you're no longer protected by the shadow of the throne. You're exposed to it. The aftermath reportedly led to swift consequences. The driver was removed from his position, cut off from the inner circle, and his access to Harlem's most powerful figure disappeared overnight. In that world, losing protection could be more dangerous than any direct punishment. The lesson was clear: business is business, but family is sacred. And in 1948 Harlem, crossing that line meant you were gambling with far more than your job. Stories like this remind us that organized crime wasn't just about money and territory. It was about hierarchy, codes, invisible rules everyone understood until someone forgot them. In 1948, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson stood at the center of Harlem's underground economy, a figure whose influence stretched far beyond street corners and backroom deals. After the imprisonment of Dutch Schultz years earlier, Bumpy had maneuvered himself into a powerful position, reportedly aligning with the Italian mafia while maintaining control over much of Harlem's numbers racket. But his authority wasn't built on fear alone. It was built on structure. There was order in his organization, clear expectations, and an understanding that loyalty was not negotiable. Harlem at the time was more than a neighborhood. It was a cultural capital. Jazz clubs lit up the night, businesses thrived along 125th Street, and the community carried both pride and pressure. In that environment, Bumpy wasn't just viewed as a criminal figure. To some, he was a protector and financier, someone who kept money circulating locally. To others, he was a man you didn't cross. His dominance came from balancing diplomacy with quiet force. What made Bumpy particularly formidable was his intelligence. He was known for reading philosophy, memorizing poetry, and thinking several steps ahead. Unlike hot-headed gangsters who ruled through chaos, he preferred calculation. Every alliance, every punishment, every show of strength had purpose. That reputation created stability in a world where instability was the norm. People followed him because they understood the consequences of disorder. His organization functioned almost like a corporation. There were layers, runners, collectors, enforcers, drivers, and trusted confidants. Each person had a defined role, and stepping outside that role could disrupt the entire structure. Proximity to Bumpy meant access, but it also meant scrutiny. The closer you were, the higher the expectation of discipline and respect. Dominance in Harlem also meant navigating racial and political tensions. As a black crime boss operating in partnership with powerful Italian syndicates, Bumpy had to maintain credibility on multiple fronts. He needed Harlem to respect him, and he needed outside allies to see him as reliable. That balancing act required control, just over territory, but over perception. A single sign of weakness could invite challenge. Respect, in Bumpy's world, extended beyond business. Family was considered sacred ground, while he kept much of his personal life private. Those around him understood there were invisible lines that could not be crossed. His authority depended not only on financial control, but on the idea that he commanded absolute respect in every sphere, professional and personal. By 1948, Bumpy Johnson's dominance was not loud, but it was unmistakable. Harlem operated with an awareness of his presence, whether seen or unseen. His leadership style, strategic, composed, and firm, created an atmosphere where loyalty was currency and betrayal was costly. In that environment, anyone within his inner circle had to remember one thing: being close to power did not make you powerful. It simply meant you were closer to the consequences. Loyalty inside Bumpy Johnson's inner circle was not a casual expectation. It was the foundation that held everything together. In a world built on illegal enterprise, there were no formal contracts, no legal protections, and no human resources department to settle disputes. Trust was the glue. If a man gave his word, word had to carry weight. Once trust cracked, the entire structure could weaken, and in organized crime, weakness attracted predators. Those closest to Bumpy operated under constant awareness that they represented him at all times. A driver, a collector, an enforcer. Each role came with responsibility beyond the job description. Their behavior in public reflected directly on the boss. A careless comment, a reckless action, or a sign of disrespect could ripple outward and damage alliances that took years to build. Loyalty meant understanding that your personal impulses came second to the organization's stability. in Harlem's tightly connected streets. Reputation traveled faster than truth. If someone in Bumpy's crew acted out of line, competitors would notice. Rivals might interpret it as a fracture within the leadership. Law enforcement might see it as an opportunity to pressure someone who felt undervalued. Loyalty wasn't just about devotion to Bumpy as a man. It was about preserving a united front that discouraged interference from both enemies and authorities. Bumpy Johnson was known for rewarding those who proved themselves dependable. Steady income, protection, and proximity to influence were powerful incentives. But those benefits were conditional. Inner circle members were expected to show discipline in their personal lives, avoid unnecessary attention, and follow unspoken rules. Loyalty included discretion. You didn't gossip, you didn't boast, and you certainly didn't make decisions that could embarrass or challenge the boss. There was also an emotional component to loyalty. In that era, loyalty often blurred into a form of brotherhood. Men who worked together daily, faced risks together, and relied on each other for safety formed tight bonds. Betrayal in that environment felt personal, not just professional. Crossing a boundary wasn't merely breaking protocol, it was violating a shared code that everyone depended on to survive. For someone in Bumpy's immediate orbit, such as a driver, loyalty carried even more weight. A driver overheard conversations, knew schedules, saw vulnerabilities. That level of access required absolute trust. If the person in that position acted selfishly or disrespectfully, it could be interpreted as arrogance, a belief that closeness to power made them untouchable. In organizations like Bumpy's, assumption could be fatal. Ultimately, loyalty in Bumpy Johnson's circle was about understanding hierarchy. Everyone had a place. Everyone knew the lines. Staying within those lines ensured protection and prosperity. Stepping outside them risked everything, only your position, but your safety. In 1948 Harlem, loyalty wasn't just a virtue, it was survival. The role of a driver in Bumpy Johnson's organization was far more significant than it might appear on the surface. This wasn't just someone holding a steering wheel. It was a position built on access. A driver spent long hours in close proximity to the boss, overhearing conversations, observing meetings, and learning patterns. He knew who Bumpy met with, where he traveled, and when he was most vulnerable. Kind of knowledge placed him in a uniquely sensitive position within the inner circle. Proximity to power can be intoxicating. When you're constantly beside a man who commands respect across Harlem, it's easy to start feeling that some of that authority rubs off on you. People recognize you. They nod differently. They treat you with a bit more caution because of who you're connected to. Over time, borrowed status can blur the lines between your actual rank and the importance you begin to imagine for yourself. Being in the car during private conversations meant exposure to strategy. The driver might hear discussions about money flows, alliances with Italian syndicates, disputes between operators, or concerns about law enforcement pressure. Even if he wasn't invited into those discussions, simply being present created an illusion of inclusion. And in structured organizations, illusion can be dangerous. It can quietly inflate confidence beyond what one's role truly allows. There was also a psychological element to daily closeness. Familiarity can reduce perceived distance. Seeing the boss laugh, speak casually, or interact with family members might create a sense of comfort. But comfort is not equality. In tightly controlled hierarchies like Bumpy's, the boundaries were invisible yet rigid. No matter how often you sat in the front seat, you were still an employee. Forgetting that distinction could carry serious consequences. The driver's position also meant he was trusted with physical safety. He controlled transportation routes, speed, and escape options. In a time when ambushes were a real threat, that responsibility was enormous. Trust at that level required discipline and humility. The boss had to believe the man behind the wheel understood his place and respected it fully. Any sign of arrogance or entitlement could quickly undermine that confidence. At the same time, others in Harlem would have viewed the driver as someone with influence. People might attempt to befriend him, flatter him, or extract information indirectly. Being that close to power invited temptation, financial, social, and personal. Handling that temptation required restraint. A single poor decision could shift how the entire organization perceived him, turning privilege into liability overnight. In environments built on hierarchy, proximity does not equal power. It magnifies responsibility. The closer someone stands to the center, the more carefully they must move. For Bumpy Johnson's driver in 1948, daily access to Harlem's most dominant figure came with invisible pressure. One misjudgment, one assumption that closeness meant freedom, could instantly transform trusted access into irreversible fallout. In 1948 Harlem, not every rule was spoken aloud. Everyone understood them. The streets operated on a code, a system of boundaries and expectations that didn't need to be written down to be enforced. These unspoken rules governed behavior, relationships, and respect. If you lived or worked within that world, you learned quickly that survival depended on reading between the lines. One of the most important codes revolved around hierarchy. Everyone had a rank, and that rank determined how you spoke, how you acted, and even how you carried yourself. You didn't overstep. You didn't assume familiarity that wasn't granted. Respect flowed upward, and protection flowed downward. Disturbing that balance could create instability. And instability was dangerous in a tightly controlled environment like Bumpy Johnson's Harlem. Family was another sacred boundary. While business could be negotiated, territories could shift, and money could be disputed, family was considered off limits. It wasn't simply about affection, it was about symbolism. A man's ability to protect his family reflected his strength. Any perceived intrusion into that space could be interpreted as a challenge to authority. Even the suggestion of disrespect could spark consequences. There was also a code of discretion. You didn't publicly embarrass your boss. You didn't create scenes that drew unnecessary attention. Harlem in the late 1940s was already under watchful eyes from law enforcement, and maintaining a low profile was part of maintaining control. Actions that stirred gossip or hinted at internal disorder threatened more than reputations. They threatened stability. Another unspoken rule was loyalty in action, not just in words. Anyone could claim devotion, but true loyalty showed through restraint. It meant knowing when not to act. It meant understanding that just because something was technically possible didn't mean it was acceptable. In that culture, self-control was often valued more than boldness. Respect toward women connected to powerful men carried particular weight. It wasn't framed in modern social language. It was about territory and honor. Crossing a line involving a boss's daughter, wife, or close female relative wasn't seen as a private romantic matter. It was interpreted through the lens of dominance and boundaries. Intent alone could shift perceptions dramatically. These rules were rarely discussed openly because they didn't need to be. They were absorbed through observation, reinforced by consequences, and sustained by collective understanding. In Harlem's underground world, survival meant recognizing invisible lines and never stepping across them. The danger wasn't just in breaking the code. It was in pretending the code didn't exist. At some point within that tightly controlled world, the driver allegedly made a move toward Bumpy Johnson's 26-year-old daughter. She was an adult woman, capable of making her own decisions. In the context of 1948 Harlem, and especially within the orbit of a powerful crime figure, the situation was layered with meaning beyond age. It wasn't simply about attraction. It was about position, perception, and the boundaries that everyone in that circle understood without needing them spelled out. The exact nature of the advance has been described in varying ways over time. Some accounts suggest flirtation. Others imply a more direct proposition. Regardless of the specifics, what mattered most was that the action was seen as crossing an invisible line. The driver wasn't just any man in Harlem. He was someone employed by and closely associated with her father. That employment created a power dynamic that complicated everything. In environments built on hierarchy, relationships are rarely neutral. A driver expressing romantic interest could easily be interpreted as overstepping his rank. Even if the approach was respectful on the surface, the deeper issue was whether he had forgotten his place. Within Bumpy's organization, proximity did not grant personal entitlement. Access to the boss's world was professional, not social. There was also the matter of optics. Harlem was a community where news traveled quickly and speculation often moved faster than facts. If people began whispering that someone from Bumpy's own inner circle was pursuing his daughter, it could be framed as either boldness or disrespect. In either case, it created conversation. Conversation around a crime boss's family was never ideal. For the daughter herself, the situation likely carried its own complexity. Being the child of a powerful and feared figure meant that many interactions were influenced by her father's reputation. Any romantic interest from someone within that sphere would automatically carry tension. Was it genuine affection, ambition, or a misguided sense of confidence born from proximity to power? Those questions would have lingered in the background. From the driver's perspective, making such a move required either courage or miscalculation. Perhaps he believed his daily presence around the family signaled a level of acceptance. Perhaps he underestimated how rigid the boundaries truly were. Or perhaps he convinced himself that, because she was an adult, the matter was purely personal. In structured organizations, however, personal decisions rarely remain personal for long. Ultimately, the reported advance was less about romance and more about interpretation. In a world governed by respect and hierarchy, intent could be overshadowed by symbolism. Whether subtle or direct, the driver's action introduced a shift in perception. And in 1948 Harlem, perception alone could change everything. In Bumpy Johnson's world, family was not just personal, it was sacred territory. Business rivals could negotiate over numbers rackets, territory lines, or partnerships. Family stood outside of those transactions. It represented a man's honor, his stability, and his legacy. In 1948 Harlem, protecting one's family wasn't simply emotional instinct. It was a visible measure of strength. If a man couldn't command respect around his own household, how could he expect to command it on the streets? For someone like Bumpy, whose authority depended heavily on perception, the protection of family carried symbolic weight. His dominance wasn't only about money or influence, it was about control. Family, being untouchable, reinforced that control. It signaled to everyone, allies, rivals, employees, that there were clear lines no one dared cross. The very idea of those boundaries being tested could create tension. Within organized crime culture, even unintended disrespect toward a family member could be interpreted as a challenge. It wasn't necessarily about jealousy or possessiveness in the romantic sense. It was about hierarchy, subordinate, showing interest in the boss's daughter, risked appearing as though he was elevating himself beyond his station. Perception alone could destabilize the order that kept the organization functioning smoothly. There was also the broader cultural context of the late 1940s. Social norms were different, especially within tightly knit communities. A father's role as protector was deeply ingrained. For a man in Bumpy's position, already navigating alliances with powerful figures and maintaining control in a competitive underworld, any perceived vulnerability in his personal sphere could be magnified by rumor. Harlem thrived on storytelling, and stories often grew in the telling. Family being sacred also meant that consequences for crossing that boundary were rarely taken lightly. Even if no harm was intended, the mere suggestion of intrusion required a response. Silence could be misinterpreted as weakness. Overreaction could create unnecessary conflict. The challenge for a leader like Bumpy was choosing a response that reinforced the code without causing chaos. For those inside the organization, the rule was clear without being spoken. The boss's family was off limits because they were distant or unapproachable, but because engaging in that space carried implications beyond the personal. Respect meant restraint. It meant understanding that some opportunities, even if they appeared genuine, were simply not yours to pursue. In that atmosphere, untouchable did not mean unreachable in a physical sense. It meant protected by an invisible wall of authority. Anyone considering stepping into that space had to weigh not just emotions, but consequences. In Bumpy Johnson's Harlem, crossing into family territory wasn't just a romantic gamble. It was a risk against the very foundation of the power structure itself. In 1948 Harlem, information moved quickly, faster than cars, faster than official reports, and often faster than truth itself. The neighborhood functioned like a living network. Barbershops, jazz clubs, corner stores, churches, brownstone stoops were all informal communication hubs. If something unusual happened, especially involving a well-known figure like Bumpy Johnson, it rarely stayed private for long. Within organized circles, News often traveled through subtle channels. A comment overheard in a hallway, a shift in someone's schedule, a driver no longer seen behind the wheel. People noticed patterns, paid attention to who was standing closer to the boss and who suddenly wasn't. In tight, knit operations, silence could be louder than an announcement. When behavior changed, speculation filled the gaps. If word spread that someone in Bumpy's inner circle had overstepped a boundary involving his family, it would have carried weight. Even if details were unclear, the mere suggestion of tension could spark whispers. Harlem's underworld thrived on perception. Rebels watched closely for signs of internal cracks. Associates monitored reactions. Law enforcement sometimes relied on street chatter to guide their investigations. Gossip in that era didn't require proof. It required intrigue. A single remark in a nightclub could evolve into a layered story by morning. By afternoon, it might reach someone connected to Bumpy's extended network. And once a story touched the edges of power, it often traveled upward. In that environment, managing narrative was almost as important as managing money. There was also the internal flow of communication within Bumpy's organization. Trusted lieutenants would quietly verify information before bringing it forward. No one wanted to present the boss with rumors unless there was substance behind them. But when the subject involved family, even unconfirmed reports demanded attention. Ignoring it could signal complacency. Addressing it too publicly could fuel more talk. The speed of information created pressure. Decisions had to be calculated, but they also had to be timely. If Bumpy reacted too slowly, it might appear that the situation was being tolerated. If he reacted too harshly without clarity, it could breed fear or resentment within his ranks. Harlem's social ecosystem forced leaders to move carefully, balancing authority with awareness. Ultimately, in a place where everyone seemed connected by only a few degrees of separation, secrets were fragile. Information didn't travel in straight lines. It rippled outward in circles, touching people in unexpected ways. And once a matter involving the inner circle entered that ripple, containment became nearly impossible. In 1948 Harlem, news wasn't just shared. It spread, and it shaped outcomes before anyone officially spoke a word. In Bumpy Johnson's world, reputation was more than personal pride. It was a form of currency that could open doors or close them permanently. Every action, every decision, every perceived slight or loyalty reinforced or weakened how others viewed him. A strong reputation commanded respect, protected allies, and deterred rivals. A weakened one invited challenge. In Harlem, where word of mouth and observation ruled, reputation was often more powerful than weapons or money. Bumpy's reputation had been meticulously built over years of navigating alliances and rivalries. He was known for being fair in business, decisive in conflict, and intelligent in strategy. People trusted him because they understood the code he lived by, and they feared him because they understood the consequences of crossing it. His reputation was both shield and sword, a tool that extended far beyond the reach of his immediate circle. The driver's alleged actions involving Bumpy's daughter didn't just risk angering the boss. They risked tarnishing the reputation Bumpy had spent years cultivating. In organizations like his, the perception of weakness could be more dangerous than actual vulnerability. Even a hint that someone close could act without fear of consequence would ripple outward, undermining authority and emboldening rivals or disloyal associates. Every individual in Bumpy's inner circle carried a part of that reputation with them. Their behavior reflected directly on him, and vice versa. If one man misstepped, observers might question whether the leader tolerated disrespect or lacked control. Maintaining a strong reputation meant managing not just personal behavior, but the behavior of those around you, ensuring that everyone understood and upheld the same code of conduct. The stakes were even higher when family was involved. Protecting one's family wasn't just a personal matter. It reinforced a public image of strength and control. Any perceived violation could signal to the wider community that Bumpy's influence had limits, even if it was only a rumor. In a world ruled by perception, the appearance of power was as vital as power itself. Reputation in Harlem was cumulative. One incident could be absorbed, forgiven, or forgotten if handled correctly. Repeated slights or a single high-profile misstep could quickly snowball. Leaders like Bumpy had to anticipate the narrative as much as the action, calculating consequences for every move in the delicate ecosystem of alliances, enemies, and community perception. Ultimately, the concept of reputation in Bumpy Johnson's Harlem was inseparable from authority. It wasn't enough to be powerful in action. One had to be perceived as untouchable, unchallengeable, and consistent. Every interaction, every rumor, every glance mattered, and even the smallest breach in respect or loyalty could threaten the carefully constructed image that protected both him and the people he led. Bumpy Johnson was known for his calm, calculated demeanor, a trait that set him apart from many of his contemporaries in Harlem's criminal underworld. Unlike hot-headed figures who reacted impulsively to threats or slights, Bumpy preferred to observe, analyze, and then act with precision. This strategic approach allowed him to maintain control without unnecessary violence, earning him a reputation as both intelligent and formidable. People learned quickly that his calm was not weakness. It was a signal that he was always thinking several moves ahead. His leadership style relied heavily on understanding human nature. He knew when to apply pressure, when to reward loyalty, and when to wait for the right moment to strike. By remaining composed, he created an atmosphere of uncertainty around his reactions. Associates never knew exactly what he might do next, which reinforced discipline within the ranks. Calmness, in Bumpy's case, functioned as both a shield and a weapon. It concealed his intentions while projecting an aura of invincibility. Even when confronted with direct challenges, Bumpy's responses were deliberate. He would weigh the consequences of action versus inaction, considering both short-term effects and long-term implications. This calculated approach extended to internal matters, including the behavior of his inner circle. If someone crossed a line, such as approaching his daughter inappropriately, his response would be measured but decisive, ensuring the message was clear without unnecessary spectacle. This calculated demeanor also had psychological effects on those around him. Associates often found themselves second, guessing their own actions and motives, aware that Bumpy was constantly assessing not only their loyalty, but their judgment. This awareness created self-discipline within the organization, as people knew that rash or impulsive behavior could be noticed and addressed with consequences that were both swift and precise. Bumpy's calm extended beyond immediate conflicts. It was part of a broader strategy to maintain Harlem's perception of his authority. People respected leaders who seemed in control at all times, and by avoiding explosive reactions, he projected stability. This gave him leverage in negotiations with rivals and allies alike, allowing him to manipulate situations to his advantage without appearing overbearing or reactive. The contrast between his calmness and the severity of his consequences was striking. While he might rarely lose his temper, when action was required, it was final and effective. This created a reputation that kept potential troublemakers in check. They knew he did not act without reason, but when he did, the outcome was undeniable. His measured approach made fear and respect coexist naturally. Ultimately, Bumpy Johnson's calm, calculated leadership reinforced the codes of his organization. It wasn't just about preventing chaos. It was about sustaining authority and hierarchy in a world governed by perception, strategy, and reputation. His composed demeanor allowed him to maintain order, assert dominance, and ensure that every member of his inner circle understood both their privileges and their boundaries. In Bumpy Johnson's inner circle, trust was the foundation of power, and breaking it had immediate consequences. The hierarchy depended on each person understanding their role and boundaries, and any deviation threatened the organization's stability. For someone in a position of close access, like the driver, loyalty wasn't optional. It was a requirement. Acting selfishly or disrespectfully could unravel years of carefully maintained order, and the repercussions were often swift and uncompromising. Breaking trust wasn't always about outright betrayal. Even subtle missteps, a comment, a flirtation, or an assumption of entitlement, could be interpreted as a challenge to authority. In the case of Bumpy's driver, making a move toward his daughter was more than a personal action. It was a violation of a boundary that symbolized respect, hierarchy, and the integrity of the inner circle. Such violations couldn't be ignored without risking further disobedience. The consequences of breaking trust served as both punishment and lesson. They reminded others of the stakes involved in operating close to power. Removing someone from a position of influence, cutting off privileges, or reassigning responsibilities was a signal to the entire organization that loyalty had tangible effects. In a structured world like Bumpy's, maintaining discipline was essential to survival. Trust also extended to knowledge and discretion. People in the inner circle were privy to sensitive information, from financial operations to potential threats. Mishandling that trust, whether through carelessness or personal ambition, could expose the organization to danger. A single act of betrayal could ripple outward, creating vulnerabilities that enemies might exploit. Loyalty and reliability were inseparable from operational security. Breaking trust impacted more than just business. It affected personal safety. In a world where power was enforced through both respect and fear, falling out of favor could leave someone exposed. The inner circle operated as a protective network, and being cast out meant losing not only influence but protection. Those who underestimated the consequences often learned the hard way that proximity to power came with real risks. The psychological weight of trust in Bumpy's circle was immense. Every decision carried potential ramifications, and people were constantly aware that misjudgment could cost them more than just their position. This awareness cultivated discipline and reinforced the hierarchy, ensuring that each member understood their limits and responsibilities. Loyalty wasn't passive, it required constant attention and judgment. Ultimately, in Bumpy Johnson's organization, breaking trust was never just an individual matter. It was a disruption to the structure that allowed the entire operation to function. The consequences reinforced the rules, reasserted authority, and reminded everyone that in that world, loyalty and respect were not optional luxuries, but essential tools for survival. When the news of the driver's inappropriate advance toward Bumpy Johnson's daughter reached the boss, the consequences were swift and decisive. In an organization built on respect, hierarchy, and loyalty, there was no room for negotiation. The driver was immediately removed from his position, cutting him off from the daily access and influence he had previously enjoyed. This wasn't just a professional demotion. It was a statement to the entire inner circle that boundaries were absolute and violations would not be tolerated. Removal from his role also meant the driver lost the protections that came with being close to Bumpy. Proximity to the boss offered safety in an unpredictable world, the shield of authority and reputation. Once that connection was severed, he was no longer insulated from the consequences of street politics, rivalries, or retaliation from others in the criminal ecosystem. The loss of protection was as significant as the loss of his job, if not more. The swiftness of the punishment reinforced the importance of immediate accountability in Bumpy's organization. Delays in addressing breaches could create uncertainty among other associates. If the driver's actions had gone unpunished, it might have been interpreted as tolerance, weakening Bumpy's control over his inner circle. Acting quickly ensured that the hierarchy remained intact and that the message about respect and loyalty was unambiguous. Beyond the practical consequences, there was a symbolic dimension to the driver's removal. It signaled to all members of the organization that personal ambition or desire had limits. No matter one's position or closeness to power, stepping beyond the invisible lines, particularly those involving family, carried real and immediate repercussions. This symbolism reinforced discipline and deterred others from testing boundaries. The decision also had a broader effect on morale and perception within the group. Loyal members observed that violations were met with firm, fair action. This cultivated trust among those who remained, showing that the system of authority was reliable and consistent. While harsh for the driver, it strengthened the organization by maintaining clarity about rules and consequences. For the driver personally, the repercussions were long-lasting. Being cut off from the inner circle meant losing influence, income, and the prestige associated with proximity to Bumpy. In a world where networks determined opportunity and survival, this effectively isolated him from the power structures that had previously supported him. His misstep became a cautionary tale for anyone else tempted to overstep. Ultimately, the driver's removal underscored a fundamental principle of Bumpy Johnson's leadership. Respect and loyalty were non-negotiable. The punishment was not merely about retaliation, it was about maintaining the integrity of the organization, reinforcing hierarchy, and protecting family. In 1948 Harlem, those lessons were clear to all. Crossing the line meant losing everything that proximity to power had provided. The incident involving Bumpy Johnson's driver left a lesson that resonated far beyond the immediate consequences. Respect and boundaries were the foundation of survival in Harlem's underworld. In a world governed by hierarchy, codes, and perception, one misstep could undo years of privilege and trust. The driver's experience served as a vivid reminder that personal ambition or desire could never outweigh the unwritten rules that maintained order. Respect in Bumpy's organization wasn't optional or symbolic, it was practical. Those who failed to honor it risked losing protection, influence, and credibility. Crossing a boundary involving family, in particular, was considered a severe violation because it struck at both the personal and symbolic heart of authority. The repercussions reinforced the idea that certain lines were absolute and could not be tested without consequence. The lesson extended to all members of the inner circle. Observing the driver's downfall, associates internalized the boundaries of acceptable behavior. They understood that privileges granted by proximity to power were conditional, and that loyalty and discretion were non-negotiable. The organization relied on these lessons being absorbed quickly to maintain stability and cohesion. Beyond the immediate circle, the story carried a broader message to Harlem and the surrounding networks. It was an example of how power was enforced, both overtly and subtly. Respecting hierarchy and personal boundaries was a survival strategy, and even those outside the organization could see the consequences of overstepping. In that sense, the incident reinforced Bumpy Johnson's reputation as a leader whose authority was absolute. The driver's experience also highlighted the balance between opportunity and restraint. Proximity to power offered influence, protection, and privilege, but it came with constant responsibility. Understanding one's limits and acting within them was essential to maintaining that position. Failing to recognize this balance could result in immediate and permanent repercussions. On a deeper level, the story illustrates the intertwining of personal and professional spheres in organized crime. The inner circle was not simply a workplace, it was a community with its own rules, hierarchies, and sacred spaces. Family, trust, loyalty were inseparable from operational success. Violating any of these elements threatened not only individual status, but the cohesion of the entire group. Ultimately, the incident served as a lasting testament to the codes that governed Bumpy Johnson's Harlem. Respect, loyalty, boundaries were not just ethical guidelines, they were tools for survival. Anyone close to power had to internalize these rules or risk losing everything. In the volatile world of 1948 Harlem, crossing a line could erase privilege, dismantle protection, turn opportunity into danger in an instant.